We've just had a week of trade war with tariffs announced, panic in a lot of the financial markets, and then a whole lot of tariffs cancelled. China may have waged some economic war against America during that time, but it also launched a different attack that's received much less attention. The US wants a new nuclear deal with Iran and is preparing for major talks tomorrow. And Germany's incoming government has reached a coalition deal. We're going to talk about all this and more on today's Trumpet World. Last week, we had a whole lot of discussion on trade wars, and this week we have had quite the roller coaster ride. So to summarize some of the ups and downs and what we've learned from this last week's news, we'll go now to our US correspondent, Andrew Miller.
Yeah, there have been quite a bit of developments in the global trade war that's currently raging around the world this week. Like I said, we talked quite a bit on the show last week about Donald Trump's Liberation Day speech. Came out and announced a baseline 10% tariff on pretty much every nation on Earth, and then focused in on something like 90 different nations on reciprocal tariffs. That caused quite a bit of turbulence in the stock market. Fell to its biggest two-day drop, I think, in American history. It also, and even more concerningly, caused quite a bit of turbulence in the bond market. The average yield on a U.S. 10-year Treasury note is now about 0.5% higher than it was before Trump's Liberation Day speech.
This is loaning money to the US government, and now people are less confident in the US government, so the government has to pay a higher interest rate to persuade investors to lend that money, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Before that, if you sold a 10-year Treasury bond, and that's basically an IOU where you borrow money from someone at what used to be a 4% interest rate for 10 years. That's now gone up to a 4.5% interest rate, and would have gone higher, except that Donald Trump saw how bad the bond market was reacting to this, and put a 90-day pause on his reciprocal tariff. So right now, the baseline 10% is still in effect. And he's actually ratcheted up his targeted tariffs on communist China up to, I think it was 145% overall last time I looked. So very targeted tariffs on China, 10% overall. But all the other reciprocal tariffs he announced on Liberation Day are on a 90-day pause, basically in hopes that the bond market will stabilize out and not go much higher than it is now. I was actually looking at this for an infographic like a couple trumpet issues ago, where the United States government estimates that by the year 2044, the interest on our national debt will be bigger than the discretionary budget. Basically meaning that all tax revenue, 100% of tax revenue, will go towards paying for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest. And the entire cost of running the government will be on borrowed money. But that projection is based on the fact that the U.S. Treasury bond yield is going to stay below 4.6. It's already at 4.5. So if it goes much higher, America's going to be to the point where it's spending all its tax revenue on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid much, much sooner than 2024. And that seems to be the main reason Donald Trump did his pause. Initially, I saw a bunch of media outlets saying that, like, oh, well, the stock market has Trump rattled. And then they had a couple statements from some senior officials in the Trump administration, basically clarifying that he said he wasn't overly concerned about the stock market. It did take a tank, but Walmart and some other big companies, they're already looking at how to reroute their supply chains to continue making profit like they always do. So the stock market would have adjusted to the new tariff world. The bond market might not. And so that seems to be Trump's taken a step back from his previous more aggressive approach on that. Because that bond market, one, it was going to drastically add interest to the U.S. national debt. But there's also, it could also influence, like, for individual citizens, your credit card rate, your mortgage rate, your auto loan rate in a way that would really hurt them. Because this is actually pretty unusual. Normally, if you ask someone like Warren Buffett, a well-respected financial advisor, will tell people, like, if they're planning to retire, he's like, well, put 90% of your investment in stocks and 10% in bonds, because that way, if you're retired and the stock market tanks, you can live off the bond money until the market rebounds. Because normally when the stock market goes up, down, the bond market goes the other way. This is really kind of a financial abnormality to have the stock market tank and the bond yield spike at the same time.
Yeah, I think this is
showing that people are they're losing confidence in the market, but they're also losing confidence in the dollar itself.
And I think this is what makes this quite a dangerous situation, and perhaps why a big part of the reason why Donald Trump rode back very quickly. I mean, you talked about there's the interest on the debt, and that can have problems very fast. But also, you look at the big financial crises. Big financial crises happen when something that everyone has assumed is true suddenly turns out to not to be. So like the dot-com boom, everyone just assumed, hey, the normal rules of investment and profit don't apply to internet businesses. Value of internet businesses is just going to go up. And then that was wrong, and you had a massive financial crisis. 2008 crisis, the fundamental assumption is houses are a safe investment. Doesn't matter whether the person you're lending money to in a mortgage can pay for that house or not, because if they can't pay, you'll be able to sell that house for more than they bought it for anyway. So it's a completely safe investment. House prices went down. It wasn't a safe investment. Banks started to go under. Euro crisis. Hey, it's completely safe to lend money to Greece because even if they're not responsible, Germany will always bail them out. Germany proved very reluctant to bail them out. Investors suddenly got squeamish about that, and you have the Euro crisis. I mean, now you've got these fundamental assumptions that treasury bonds are 100%, like they're safe investments. And just as you say, like they're safe hedges. When the financial market goes down, treasury bonds go up. And suddenly that's not true. And that's where things can kind of blow up because banks have built their investment strategies based on these assumptions. And they've assumed, hey, this is safe. And if this asset class that they've always assumed is safe suddenly turns out to not be safe, well, that's when banks can go insolvent. And when they've always assumed, hey, these things are going to become more valuable in hard times, and suddenly they start to become less valuable, banks don't have enough assets to meet their obligations. They have to start fire selling, and this is where things start snowballing, and you can have major crises. So I think we may well have come very close to disaster. And just like you said at the end there, it's a treasury bond crisis. It's also a dollar crisis. And we've seen more of that just today where China came along and they've said, well, we're putting 125% tariffs on American-made goods. You're having various, this is someone from the bank ING, I think it's a Dutch bank. The question of a potential dollar confidence crisis has now definitely been answered. We are experiencing one in full force. Noruma strategist, I'm deeply concerned about a lack of confidence among investors in the US now. Analysis at Rabobank, the focus has now shifted. The inability of the US Treasury market and the US dollar to function as safe havens over the past week has upended market norms and undermined the benefits of the US exceptionalism. Like America can borrow what it can borrow and live the life that it can live because people fundamentally trust the dollar. And that is what has taken a massive hit this week.
Yeah, and that's a really good point with some tremendous prophetic implications. I actually brought a paragraph with me today from our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Flurry from his booklet, Daniel Unlocks Revelation. I think the most recent edition of that booklet was published in 2019. But this paragraph is an edited version of a paragraph he actually wrote in a Trumpet article all the way back in 1995, where he says that he said, when the United States became the world's leading creditor nation after World War II, the U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency. But now the U.S. is the world's leading debtor nation. Nations are working to find an alternative to the dollar and are starting to dump their dollar holdings and buy gold, euro, and other currency. Once the demand for dollars declines, U.S.'s creditors will demand a higher interest rate, which will make America's staggering debt far worse. Politicians may implement policies to delay economic collapse, but they're doing nothing to reverse this nation-destroying trend. The massively debt-burdened American economy simply cannot continue indefinitely. How long will America's economic Armageddon be delayed? Until God's work is finished, then God will protect his people who are doing his work. And that quote actually it's in context of the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, kind of responding to this financial crisis in the United States. But it's basically telling us exactly what we're seeing this week is America became the reserve currency during a time when it was the world's biggest creditor nation. That's no longer true. It's the world's biggest debtor nation. It pays a tremendous amount of money every year in interest on its national debt. And those interest payments are going up because foreign nations are demanding a higher return on U.S. Treasury bonds because they're losing faith in the dollar. Donald Trump's tariff announcement didn't create this circumstance out of thin air. Like I said, we've been writing about this since the 1990s and before. However, Donald Trump's tariff announcement has rattled many of the nations that do buy U.S. debt and is pushing them to demand higher interest rates on that national debt faster, which does highlight just how much of a strategic vulnerability the national debt is. Donald Trump, he commonly likes to quote famous American leaders from the 19th century, people like William McKinley, who were very pro-tariff, who were very protectionist, who wanted a lot of industry to come into America. And there's a lot of people with strong opinions on whether protectionism versus free trade is good economic policy. Although you do have to admit, though, that when America had a more protectionist foreign policy, we didn't have much of a national debt, and we were on the gold standard. So how the bond market reacted wasn't something anyone was worried about. Now that we do have to sell, I think this year we're going to have to refinance quite a bit of our debt. So we're going to have to sell $11 trillion worth of treasury bonds. And so if you're trying to enact a more protectionist trade policy, how the people who buy American bonds react is now all of a sudden a very important question.
And this is all about confidence in the U.S. financial systems. That was a great quote you brought from Mr. Flurry. Here's a clip that I brought from a Key of David, talking about a similar subject. He's talking about an article that's talking about people losing trust in the U.S. financial system. But this is from 2013.
The article goes on to say the move marks an extraordinary breakdown in trust between leading central banks. Now, this is the Telegraph of London, one of the most important newspapers in the world, and one of the most well-known and one of the oldest. And what are they saying? Well, they're saying there's a big problem ahead because of for the dollar, because, well, the Americans are no longer going to have the reserve currency anymore. Why would people want it as a reserve currency when we just keep printing trillions and trillions of dollars out of thin air? How deadly dangerous is that? I mean, how horribly dangerous is it? Well, it's so easy for banks to cook the books and do all kinds of things. But look, as we read, central banks have to trust each other to make this system work. And if people don't believe in the system, then it's going to break down. And it's going to break down the global economy. And only those who are having a strong economy and gold to back their currency are going to survive in this coming world. The rest of them are going to be in great crisis and are going to totally and completely collapse. That's also prophesied.
So this is a very dangerous situation, as Mr. Flurry pointed out, because we've just been recklessly printing dollars. I mean, it reminds me of what we had in Britain with Liz Truss maybe a year or two ago, where she came in, she brought in a bunch of economic reforms. I mean, I kind of agreed with her economic reforms. I thought they were some quite good ideas overall. Deregulating, getting some more growth going, lowering taxes. But Britain, like America, is heavily in debt. And the people that loan Britain money in the financial markets didn't think they were good ideas. And so at that point, doesn't matter what the prime minister thinks, doesn't matter what I think, doesn't matter what the majority of voters think. Because if people are no longer willing to loan you money and you're dependent on that money, you can't run an economy. And interest bond yields started spiking up. The interest rates that Britain had to pay to loan money started going up. This caused all kinds of problems for pension funds that had assumed that their bond that they'd invested in would be a stable investment. And when yields go up, the value of existing bonds goes down. So a bunch of financial institutions got into trouble, and it basically came down within a matter of days to either Liz Truss went or the entire economy collapsed. And she had to resign in a matter of weeks. And I think it's something kind of similar here where were Donald Trump's tariffs a good idea or a bad idea? Well, doesn't really matter what he thinks, what American voters think, necessarily what the truth is. What matters is the financial markets. Because as the Bible says, as the Proverbs say, the borrower is servant to the lender. And by borrowing all of this money, America has made itself the servant of international markets, many of whom are foreign governments. And there was talk of maybe China selling US Treasury bonds and Japan selling US Treasury bonds. I don't know if we have the evidence necessarily that was happening, but that certainly could happen. And they can decide to sell US Treasury bonds, crash the market, take down the American financial system. And with our massive debt, we are servant to the lender, and we have given potent weapons into the hands of our enemies here.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I was actually doing a little bit of math yesterday evening on what they call the Chinese nuclear option. China owns about 760 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds outright, probably closer to $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds if you count some shadow companies in Europe that holds bonds that are actually controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so they're probably not going to dump those all at once because that would arguably hurt their economy more than it would hurt ours. It would at least be a mutually harmful decision. But if they did that, I think the Council on Foreign Relations estimates that bond yields would spike up 0.3 percentage points like in a day. Which isn't necessarily end of civilization type stuff, but it would add $33 billion in interest payments to the national debt. And if it rattled markets, the other nations started following suit, could be much worse than that and be a major blow towards the dollar's reserve currency status. That's why they call it the nuclear option. It's kind of a last resort for China. But the ripple effects from it could either end the dollar's reserve currency status or at least be the beginning of the end of the dollar's reserve currency status, which was what Mr. Flurry was talking about in that quote, that like if foreign nations no longer need to keep dollar reserves in their banks, they no longer need to buy treasury bonds. America still needs to sell them. So if you want to sell something that no one wants to buy, you just have to make it worth their while by giving them a higher percent of return. So now you're not spending 4% return on a treasury bond. You're getting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% return on a U.S. treasury bond. And you take that percentage rate and you multiply it by the national debt, and you're very quickly in a circumstance where you're spending well in excess of $1 trillion a year just in interest on the national debt. We already spend more in interest on the national debt than the military, and are on track within the next decade or so to be spending more on the interest on the national debt than on our entire discretionary budget. And so, this is like end of empires type stuff. Or many of us have quoted Niall Ferguson saying that empires usually fall apart when the cost of servicing their debt is more than the cost of defending their borders. And that's because it's like when you're spending $1 trillion on your national debt, you start getting to circumstances where J.D. Vance starts complaining that Europe's a bunch of freeloaders who can't defend the Red Sea by themselves, because America doesn't want to be able to defend the Red Sea because we can't really afford to be able to defend the Red Sea and pay our national debt both. You can do one or the other, but maybe not both, especially when interest rates are that high. So that just really creates a condition where America has to like pull back its overseas, protecting its overseas assets, just because of a budget crunch, where you're slashing defense spending so that you can actually just keep up with these crazy interest payments.
End of empire scenario. I mean, that's a great way of putting it. And that itself is prophetic. That God gave America and Britain huge national blessings of wealth and prosperity. And Mr. Armstrong talks about this in his book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. And those same prophecies say, God would give these blessings, but if we didn't obey him, that he would remove them. And instead, to correct us, to push us to obey him, to live the way of life that is going to bring yet more blessings, well, he would send curses. And those will be heavy, heavy financial curses. And it talks about even in some of these blessing and cursings chapters in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, you're going to be borrowing from other nations, and they're going to be high over you. And ultimately, it's going to end with being besieged, being blocked out from world trade, your defenses crumbling, and the fall of our nations, and then ultimately foreign invasion. I mean, this is end of empire. And so that's one consequence of what we're seeing now. That's not necessarily going to happen next week. I think there's not necessarily an immediate alternative to the dollar that people can go out and buy right now. I mean, people aren't really going to trust the Chinese yuan. They always, the China always weakens their currency in these kind of situations. They're doing so already. There's pretty big question marks hanging over the euro at the moment. So that may well buy America some time, that there's not a simple, easy alternative out there. But that is where we're heading. But also, this is a catalyst for a whole range of other Bible prophecies. So this week, we've seen a lot of China and Europe talking. We've seen the Spanish Prime Minister heading over to China to go discuss this situation. Just this morning, we had Xi Jinping when he announced, okay, we're putting tariffs of 125% on America. He also was saying, well, we should team up. He reportedly said China and Europe should fulfill their international responsibilities and jointly resist unilateral bullying practices. And they should safeguard their own legitimate rights and interests. So these two nations are coming together, and they're talking about ending their dependence on the United States by working together, by trading more together, and by creating joint financial instruments so they don't have to depend on the dollar, so they can't be punished by the United States. That is a massive fulfilled prophecy. Isaiah chapter 23 talks about a mart of nations, a trading empire that includes Europe and China. It's all there in biblical language. And we're seeing these nations come together to oppose the US, and they're the ones that will besiege the US. And then another part of this is Mr. Armstrong repeatedly said, well, watch for a financial crisis in America to prompt Europe to unite and come together. Here's a clip. This is from a 1984 sermon that Mr. Armstrong gave. It's just a few clips from throughout that message where he talked about this.
But the important thing is, and I think we've been overlooking it until now, that all of the relationships internationally, one nation with another, one human being with another, are regulated in this world system of wanting to get are all involved with money. And there is a money crisis now. And in the days of these kings, those toes which represent a nation to be formed, as I told you, in Europe when they go together. Now they're trying to form that now, and this economic crisis may be the thing that'll plunge them into it.
So this financial crisis, and I think the turmoil that we're seeing now, this is going to spur Europe to come together, to unite, to form a viable alternative to the dollar. And we're seeing Europe unite in opposition to the tariffs. This was one thing that they took away from this. Friedrich Merz this week, he came out and he said, well, the day that America kind of backtracked on a lot of those tariffs, he said, see, this is what happens when Europe stands together. If we come together, we can stand up to the United States and we can form our own economic union, our own major power. So this is accelerating Bible prophecy in so many ways. So keep watching this story over the next week. And Andrew, I think you had a few other stories as well to bring us from the United States.
Yeah, well, definitely all this debt and bankruptcy and bond market turmoil and stock market turmoil is definitely some pretty heavy and sobering curses on America we've been talking about so far this program. I do have three other small stories that are more positive news related to the 2 Kings 14 Jeroboam resurgence. The Supreme Court this week actually lifted a lower court decision blocking the Trump administration from using the Enemy Aliens Act to deport Venezuelan gang members from the United States. I think you remember a couple weeks ago we were talking about how like a lower court judge said that Donald Trump couldn't deport gang members without trial, even if they were foreigners and members of a terrorist organization. The Supreme Court stepped in this week and said that that ruling's null and void. He says the government does have to give deportees a reasonable amount of time to challenge their removal, but after that reasonable amount of time, he can use the Enemy Aliens Act to send those people back to Venezuela. So big victory for border security there that the Supreme Court's delivered the United States. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also announced that the U.S. and Panama have reached an expanded security relationship that he believes is going to help the U.S. military keep China away from Panama and the Panama Canal, giving us a bit more trade security at a time when tariffs are creating a lot of turmoil in international trade. And Australia this week as well, another English-speaking nation, declined an overture from China to work together to counter U.S. tariffs, saying they would instead prefer to just diversify their trade market so they're not overly dependent on the United States or China, which is another bit of positive news for the United States, saying that Australia is not just going to act like a Chinese lackey in this trade war between the U.S. and China, but is actually going to give the United States some more support than some people assumed in this trade war.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Andrew. Well, there's been a lot of speculation about did China attack America economically through the bond market this week, and I don't have any clear answers for you on that. But there is another attack that we have had some information about this week that has been much more overlooked. And Asia correspondent Jeremiah Jacques is going to tell us more about it.
Right. The big story that I wanted to talk about for Asia this week is that Chinese Communist Party officials admitted during a meeting that they have been behind years of serious cyber attacks called Volt Typhoon cyber attacks that have been carried out against American infrastructure. So this was revealed in a bombshell report by the Wall Street Journal just yesterday. And it's quite a big deal because in the past, the Chinese Communist Party has always either blamed rogue actors for conducting the Volt Typhoon attacks, or it has denied that the attacks have happened at all. So that's usually how it goes. But during a private meeting back in December, a high-ranking cyber official with China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a guy named Wang Li, he indicated that the Chinese Communist Party has been behind these attacks all along. And he said that they were due to America's support for Taiwan. So it's a bombshell because these attacks from Volt Typhoon are extremely serious. They use a toxic script called Web Shell to give Chinese operatives basically remote access to servers. And this has enabled the Chinese to infiltrate all kinds of US systems related to construction, communications, education, government operations, maritime activity, manufacturing, and electrical and gas utilities. And the US Navy even came out and specifically admitted that some of its systems have been compromised by Volt Typhoon as well. And so far, no damage has come from these Volt Typhoon attacks because the whole purpose is just to quietly embed this toxic script, which gives China remote access. And then all the hackers have to do is wait. They wait for the right time to essentially flip the switch on this code, and then it'll execute some devastating attacks on all of these systems at the very moment when those attacks are the most disruptive to the United States. So you can imagine a scenario when China attacks Taiwan and America's ready to mobilize and deploy warships and help our ally, but suddenly none of the communication systems are working correctly. Suddenly the power is out at our major base in Guam. Suddenly the navigation systems on our aircraft carriers are malfunctioning in inexplicable ways. But it's not inexplicable. It's because that was the right moment for the Chinese to flip the switch on Volt Typhoon. And it means that the US's ability to respond would be crippled. So these are extremely pernicious attacks that have been happening with Volt Typhoon. The US State Department actually called them some of the gravest and most persistent threats to US national security. And here we have the Chinese saying this week, or it saying actually back in December, but only revealed this week, you know, I know we've always denied involvement, but yeah, it was us. So this is very interesting. It's very disturbing. And it shows that the Chinese want American leaders to know that they do have this toxic code already embedded in many of our critical systems, and all they have to do is flip the switch when they want to. And of course, the US has been trying to find compromised systems and repair or replace them, but they admit that it's tremendously difficult to detect this in many systems. So it has very grave implications for Taiwan, but really even beyond that. It seems that the trigger could be pulled here at any time, and it could seriously complicate any sort of U.S. reaction. So these reports about Volt Typhoon, they're very worrying. But for those who follow the trumpet, they shouldn't be surprising, because Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry has actually been sounding the alarm for years now about the danger of America's dependence on computer systems that are vulnerable to hijacking, particularly in the military realm. All the way back in the mid-90s, he first started warning about this. He said at that time that the threat reminded him of a passage in Ezekiel 7. And this passage describes a future time when America will be punished for its refusal to turn to God. And verse 14 describes one aspect of that punishment. It says, "They've blown the trumpet, even to make all ready, but none goes to the battle, for my wrath is upon all the multitude thereof." End quote. Mr. Flurry said that this is about a time in the near future when America's military technology will have been hacked and hijacked by adversaries, and it keeps us from really mobilizing and responding. And you can see how that could happen if certain communication systems and navigation systems and other technologies were compromised by something like Volt Typhoon. So it's very sobering to think about the full potential of these kinds of attacks and to see the Chinese here saying, we can do this to you. And for anyone who would like to understand that in the context of Bible prophecy, we have an article that's called China Hacks America and None Goes to Battle that goes through all of that.
Well, thank you very much for that succinct report, Jeremiah. And then I think you had a couple of other stories to give us a quick rundown with as well for what's been going on in Asia.
Yes, that's right. First up, Chinese soldiers are fighting for Russia against Ukrainians. The latest report says that this is not just a handful of Chinese soldiers, but more than 150 of them. They've been identified fighting alongside Russian forces. A couple of these guys have even been captured by the Ukrainians, and they're being interviewed at this time. And it looks like these are mostly just mercenaries, and that they're there in, a voluntary capacity rather than being there under official orders from the Chinese Communist Party. But it's still very significant to see Chinese soldiers risking their lives and losing their lives in some cases in order to further Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions. If you've read our booklet, Russia and China in Prophecy, then you know that the Bible makes clear that there will soon be a colossal Asian army with Putin at the helm and with China supplying a huge amount of the manpower, and they'll be playing a major role in the world's deadliest conflict ever. So to see these Chinese troops right now fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Russians, it's a chilling preview, I think, of what is to come. And then one final story here, also related to Russia's war, and that is that Japan wants its soldiers to gain military experience by participating in the NATO command for its mission or its mission to Ukraine. So the Japanese say that they want to help Ukraine. They've already been giving equipment and funding to the Ukrainians, and now they're talking about sending Japanese troops, not to fight in the war, but just to take part in the NATO mission, kind of on the borders near Ukraine. And this would be invaluable to the Japanese military. Japanese soldiers have not seen combat for 80 years since their defeat at the end of World War II. But right now, the Japanese hear war drums pounding with China, with Russia, and with others. And they know that the United States can't be counted on to defend them. President Trump tries to make that clear very often. So the Japanese want to be ready to fight. And by taking part in this NATO mission, they'll be able to study the Russians and the Ukrainians, and they'll be able to acquire some invaluable know-how about modern battlefield tactics and warfare. So really, this is just one more in a long list of developments showing that Japan is saying sayonara to pacifism, and they're on the march.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jeremiah. Well, moving on from one US enemy to another, Iran is getting even closer to a nuclear bomb. It could make the weapons-grade uranium that it needs to make a bomb within days. No one wants a nuclear-armed Iran, so the US and the EU are stepping up pressure, stepping up rhetoric, and also stepping up diplomacy. So to tell us more about it, we'll turn now to our Middle East correspondent, Mihailo Zekic.
Yes, so on Sunday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to Washington, where he had an impromptu call to visit with President Donald Trump. On Monday, they had the meeting in the Oval Office with media, and this is what President Trump had to say in that meeting.
We're having direct talks with, wait. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen.
pretty explosive news coming from there. Netanyahu, for his part, he looked a little bit uncomfortable throughout the whole meeting and didn't say much, which suggests that he may have even been blindsided by that. But we've gotten more details since that announcement came out. As you mentioned, talks with Iran with the U.S. will start in Oman tomorrow. There's been a bit of back and forth on whether these are direct or indirect. Each side wants to make themselves look the most prestigious, etc. But either way, they are talking tomorrow. What exactly are these going to look like? What is everybody's aims? Well, Mr. Trump mentioned in his Oval Office announcement that he's hoping it would look pretty similar to what he calls the Libya option, what George W. Bush did in 2003, where Libya dismantled the entirety of its nuclear weapons program and sent it over to the United States. The Iranian position is that's not happening, and even if that were a subject of negotiations, the Iranian nuclear program is much more developed and advanced than Libya's ever was when those discussions were happening. But either way, Iran is seriously entertaining the idea of reaching some sort of deal. Their foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, who was the nuclear negotiator for the last deal under Barack Obama, wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post on April 8th called "The Ball is in America's Court," where he made announcements like so, quote, "Iran is ready to engage in earnest and with a view to seal a deal." Basically saying we're not going to dismantle everything, we're still under the guise that this is a peaceful deal, etc., that this is a peaceful nuclear program and we just want to allay people's fears, but we are open to a deal. During this time, of course, the United States also sent B-2 bombers to the British Indian Ocean territory where they could reach Iran. They're potentially equipped with bunker busters, and it has been confirmed that this is a little bit of saber rattling on America's part to try and reach a deal. So you could say that President Trump maybe is preparing for the worst case scenario. He mentioned that the alternative in his message is always there. It was announced earlier this week that Trump is sending his regular peace negotiating envoy, Steve Witkoff, over to lead the negotiations. And in a recent episode or interview with Tucker Carlson, which we've talked about on this show before, he's made his views on what he hopes to get with Iran plain even back then.
I think that it has a real possibility of being solved diplomatically, not because I've talked to anybody in Iran, but just because I think logically it makes sense that it ought to be solved diplomatically. It should be. I think the president has acknowledged that that he's open to an opportunity to clean it all up with Iran, where they come back to the world and be a great nation once again.
So as you can see here, he's quite optimistic as to what's going to happen with all of this. And the Iranians know that, and they've seen his progress that he's done with Russia, with Hamas, with all these other traditional American enemies, with these traditional Israeli enemies. I think they have quite a good reason to be optimistic on their side in negotiating with Witkoff. Iran, for their part, they've already said the only thing they're going to be talking about is the nuclear issue. They're not going to touch on any other issue, including its ballistic missile program, which is the other side of the coin of the nuclear issue. They wouldn't be developing their ballistic missiles as they would be if they weren't planning on putting a nuclear payload on there. So what does all this mean going forward? Well, we'll find out tomorrow, but President Trump, he withdrew from the Obama-era nuclear deal, which we've obviously been talking about for quite a while and how bad it was, and President Trump recognized that when he pulled out of it in 2018. But if these signs are any indication, it looks like with him approaching Iran with this olive branch, while Iran is saying all these things on what they're not prepared to do, they're not prepared to compromise on this, they're not prepared to compromise on that, it looks like he may actually bring a deal that's similar enough to Obama's nuclear deal. Axios reported yesterday that Iran, in these talks, is even willing to immediately agree to an interim nuclear agreement, which the details they hadn't released, but possibly could include them freezing their current enrichment and allowing the snapback sanctions of the previous deal, which we've covered on a previous program, to extend past October in exchange for Trump withdrawing his maximum pressure campaign. You heard Witkoff there in the announcement, or in the interview, that he wants Iran, by extension President Trump wants Iran to be integrated into the world economy, to start functioning like a normal nation. That is basically the premise of the Obama-era deal, or at least one of the main premises. So it looks like Iran may be able to have its cake and eat it too. And of course, all that money flushing in, Iran immediately transfers it over to terrorist purposes. That's why October 7th happened. And Mr. Trump said that October 7th wouldn't have happened on his watch if he was in power at the time. But he's creating, if this goes forward, the same conditions that led up to it.
It does seem like we've had two different Donald Trumps, or in some ways, and it's sometimes hard to know which one you're going to get on some of these foreign policy deals, where he's talked very tough about Hamas and about taking tough action. And then we saw the deal that he kind of arm twisted Benjamin Netanyahu into back in January, February, that was just a terrible ceasefire deal that has now completely fallen apart. I do think there's a lot of uncertainty as to which Donald Trump we're going to get on the Iran deal. And we have seen leaders, we have seen Benjamin Netanyahu, basically, his side of the story that he's kind of laid out this week is it's going to be a deal similar to the one that Gaddafi signed more than 10 years ago, where it was basically, the deal is you dismantle your nuclear weapons or we'll do it for you. Like, they've all got to go. And this is much less of a Barack Obama Iran nuclear deal and much more of a gun to your head. Are you going to drop your weapon or are we going to have to shoot you? Whereas Steve Witkoff's perspective and him being the negotiator points to something very different. So we have a lot of different rhetoric on this, and we'll have to see exactly which way it goes. And I think this could be crucial for the Donald Trump administration. And this is where Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry had his article, President Trump Betrayed Israel, where he talked about how Donald Trump desperately needs some good advice on the Middle East and some good advisors and not understanding the region. And he said, well, this is going to be a disaster, what happens for Israel, unless he turns it around. And maybe this meeting tomorrow could be a really important turning point for us to understand, well, is he turning it around or is he going in the same direction? And like you say, the fact that he's got the same people doing the deals and that it's Witkoff doesn't look promising. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess, to see exactly which side of Donald Trump we're going to see this weekend. And I think the other side of it is that he has done so much, sadly, talking tough and then lack of follow through. You can see Iran not necessarily taking him seriously. And I think there's indications that Iran is doing that, where they've kind of said, well, you don't need to listen to the threats. I think, for example, the way that he said, hey, Iran, you've got to get in line with the Houthis or we'll punish you. And I think to his credit, he's been dealing with the Houthis a lot more strongly than Joe Biden has been dealing with the Houthis. But he did say that he would deal with Iran, and that if Iran stopped supporting the Houthis, he would deal with them. Not deal as in making a trade deal, but deal as in take care of the problem. That's not happened. And so I think there's an Iranian perception that he's a paper tiger. So, I mean, we may reach a situation where Donald Trump has to take military action, which military action against Iran, I think, is necessary, but I don't think we can't get away with the fact that it would be very tough as well. So he's got to make that hard call or compromise. And I think that might be one of the most important decisions that he makes as president, and may even set a tone for the rest of his presidency. So far, the odds look like we might be looking more towards everything that we've had over the years of American foreign policy, where America compromises rather than deals with difficult issues. But if anyone is going to deal with the difficult issues, it would be him. He's had more courage to do that than just about any other president that's been there for decades. So a lot riding on the meeting tomorrow.
Very much so. This is what our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Flurry, said in a Key David clip in 2016 when the Obama nuclear agreement came into force.
But they keep pushing and pushing, and they're going to push until they get into World War III, and there's a reason why they don't fear that. They actually relish the idea and the thought of doing that. Now we've given them over $100 billion, and they can export more terror, and that's exactly what they will do. And there's no way you're going to negotiate with people with that mindset. They're like the Nazis in the 30s. You just, if you want to just surrender to them and give them everything they want, well, then you might be able to talk to them a little while, but it's not something where you'll ever come out winning because they only negotiate if they can get what they want.
So this is the perspective that Iran had all the way back then. Why are we talking about this on this program where we analyze news events in terms of Bible prophecy? There is no scripture that says, and the Islamic Republic of Iran shall get to nuclear negotiation. But the Bible does have a lot to say about nuclear proliferation and this dangerous era of nuclear weapons, of weapons of mass destruction that we live in. Matthew 24, verses 21 and 22 is a scripture editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Flurry. Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong before him have gone back to over and over again as a summation of what world conditions are leading to. I'll read it out. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. This is a prophecy of Jesus Christ right before he was crucified on what would follow up right before his second coming. And mankind has never had the capacity to do this until nuclear weapons, until weapons of mass destruction became commonplace. This is a time period for now. Other prophecies, like in Daniel 12, verse 1, likewise speak of an event unparalleled catastrophe. It's talking about the same event. But Daniel also specifies what's going to cause this event. Daniel 11, verse 40 says that this chain of events culminating in nuclear war starts with a push by the king of the south, which Mr. Flurry identifies as Iran. We've covered that on this program many times. We have much literature on our website to prove that. So World War III, a nuclear war, starts with provocations from Iran. And this is what Mr. Trump is playing with when his negotiators go to Oman tomorrow to figure things out. One more clip from Mr. Flurry, a 2015 key of David, when the nuclear agreement was first reached under Obama.
I'm telling you, all this whole nuclear deal revolves around many Bible prophecies, like Matthew 24, verses 21 and 22, Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2, when we're going to have the worst suffering ever on this earth because we're going to use those nuclear bombs if we don't wake up. And there's no indication that we will. Ezekiel 6 talks about cities without inhabitant, without even one inhabitant. Now, what could possibly cause that? Only nuclear weapons, really. Now, the many people believe that, and again, this is not taking a partisan view at all. But there is something that people do not understand. Iran is just not another nation, not just another nation with nuclear bombs. There is no other nation on this earth with nuclear bombs like Iran is. Not another one. And you need to understand, we all need to understand why. He believes, and many others believe, that we don't have a right to tell anybody who should have nuclear weapons and who shouldn't. But look, what if those people are building up that power to destroy you and to destroy the little Jewish state in Israel and publicly state it repeatedly? Would you do something if you thought you could survive as a nation? That's what Ezekiel 33 is all about. It's about the death of nations. And it's a prophecy for our time. And
that was back in 2015. That nuclear agreement has been since made null and void to an extent. But now, further on down the timeline, we're up to potentially another nuclear agreement that could very well lead to this end. So whatever happens on Saturday in Oman, keep your eyes on it, and we'll probably have a lot more to talk about it this time next week.
So the rise of Iran, critical prophecy, Israel, the Jewish nation in the Middle East, turning to Europe for help instead of relying on the United States like they do right now. Critical Bible prophecy. I mean, these are major, epic Bible prophecies, key milestones on the road to the return of Jesus Christ. So, watch that. And like I said, it could be even decisive, telling us a lot of important things about Donald Trump's foreign policy. And even I think it points to our latest Trumpet print magazine that we've kind of alluded to with the cover article there. The Fatal Flaw in Trump's Foreign Policy is the title of that, talking about how man doesn't know the way to peace. I feel like that's come up quite a lot on this show. That's that's a theme of the last few months. And I think that's something that God is really exposing. We don't know the way to peace. We don't know how to solve conflicts. It's something that man has to turn to God to get that understanding. So you can get more about that in our Trumpet print magazine. You can read about that on our website, thetrumpet.com. You can subscribe, get your own free print copy, and we'll make sure to put a link to that in the show notes. And we're very happy to send that to you. Well, did you want to give us a quick rundown of the other important news from the Middle East this week?
Yes, I'll just cover one story. It's a bit of a longer one. The New York Times yesterday released a report citing confidential sources with knowledge of closed-door negotiations of some of the details that were going on with U.S. hostage negotiations with Hamas that were going on last month. These are independent of the Israeli negotiations. They were focusing on Eden Alexander, the one presumed to be living American hostage still in Hamas captivity. I'll summarize the article for sake of time, but the implication the New York Times gave was that the U.S. negotiator, Adam Boehler, was willing to offer people in Israeli prisons, including people serving life sentences, aka Palestinian terrorists, including up to 250 people altogether, for that one person without even informing the Israelis. And they, according to the Times, they purposely did not tell the Israelis what was going on because they thought the Israelis wouldn't agree to it and they would cause problems to get the deal forward. Once Israel found out about the deal, there were a few angry phone calls, there were leaks to the media that derailed the whole process. But it looks like, if the report is to be believed, the United States was prepared to blindside Israel with its own independent deal of Hamas that they weren't even telling Israel was going to happen, saying, we just reached this deal, you are going to release all these terrorists in exchange for this one person. And the fact that they were keeping Israel in the dark about this, I think it goes to tie in a lot of the things you mentioned with Mr. Flurry's article, President Trump betrays Israel. That was what he wrote with the original ceasefire deal that was orchestrated in December. That kind of thinking, at least among some of President Trump's diplomats, is still in there. Who knows how much he himself wasn't knowledgeable of what exactly they were talking about in Qatar, but that thinking is still among a decent amount of important people in the administration.
And that's more evidence that Donald Trump does not know the way to peace. Well, thank you very much for that, Mihailo. Germany has a government, or at least is much closer to getting one. The left and the right-wing parties announced their coalition agreement. They've divided up who gets what jobs. They've settled on their major programs. So there's still more to do before Friedrich Merz is officially inaugurated as Germany's next chancellor. From here on out, the parties involved, so the left-wing Social Democratic Party, the right-wing Christian Democratic Union, and then their kind of partners that they always work hand in glove with, the Christian Social Union, they need to formally agree to this. So for the Social Democrats, all of their members have to vote. So that's all kind of the equivalent of the members, rank and file members of the Democratic Party. They've got to get a majority support. For the Christian Union parties, it's more of the executive committee or something like that has to sign off on it. But the new chancellor is expected to be inaugurated somewhere around the 5th, 6th, 7th of May. So that's the timescale that we're looking at. Friedrich Merz would be the chancellor. Boris Pistorius, the Social Democrat, is expected to continue leading the defense ministry. I think that's fairly significant. He has been a critical figure for this military turnaround in Germany. The Christian Union or the Christian Democratic Union is going to take over the foreign ministry. That's the first time in almost 60 years that they've taken the foreign ministry. There'll be a new ministry for space and digitalization. I think that's going to be very interesting to watch what Germany does there. I mean, we were talking about with Jeremiah some of these kind of more modern threats of cyber warfare, and Germany has been particularly advanced in forming branches of its military exclusively focused on cyber warfare. So to see them have a ministry dedicated to that, I think we will see Germany put more attention on things like cyber warfare and some of these advanced technologies. A lot of the biggest thing that they could agree on was really around strengthening the military. There's a lot, though, that they didn't agree on. I think one of the big takeaways, though, is just how desperate all of Europe is to have a strong leader. Friedrich Merz is considerably stronger than Olaf Scholz. And nobody is saying we're not sure that Germany has a stronger leader than Olaf Scholz. We're not sure about whether we like the idea of a strong German leader. Instead, the response really is two things. Finally, yes, we've been waiting years for a strong leader from Germany. And two, is he strong enough? We're not sure that he is. We think he needs somebody stronger. So the Telegraph had this article, I think yesterday or in this morning's edition, Friedrich Merz, the man Europe has been waiting for. And it says in here, there are hopes that an assertive German chancellor at the helm of what is still the continent's richest economy can be the game changer Europe needs. So they're looking at this and they're saying, he did get this coalition deal done for what is for Germany incredibly quickly. Normally, it's a very relaxed, lackadaisical process. Lots of wine is drunk in late evening meetings. Merz banned the wine, said, we're getting this done. We're getting this done quickly. We want it done by Easter. I want to be in office as soon as possible. And the European response is like, thank you, finally. This article states, in Brussels and beyond, EU governments have felt the absence of Germany during the drift of the 3 years and 3 months of Scholz's leadership. They talked about how they wanted more German leadership with Angela Merkel. They talk about how much influence Germany has in Europe, but without a strong leader, they can't really use that influence to get anything done, and nothing happens. So all of Europe wants something to get done. This article also says German officials have been slightly taken aback by the wave of positive publicity and enthusiasm in Europe that followed Mr. Merz's announcement of defense reforms. I mean, this is prophecy fulfilled. You're having a stronger leader in Europe, and you're having Germany beef up its military, and all of Europe is like, yes, we want more of this. It says, after years of hesitant and fretful approach under Olaf Scholz, the outgoing chancellor, Mr. Merz, has ushered in a paradigm shift already. So Europe wants this. But they also have a quote from a European envoy in Berlin that says this: both Paris and London should realize Berlin is now ready to move. It will no longer make itself dependent on DC, Washington, DC, America, but also not on Paris or London. Okay, we want to make ourselves independent of America, but we're not going to put ourselves in thrall to Paris or London either. If you want us to lead Europe, we're calling the shots. We're doing it our way. And this is exactly what Mr. Flurry, what Mr. Armstrong have been writing about for years. I'll play you a couple of clips from that. But just to go in a little more, there's, I think, another important aspect of these coalition deals to talk about is this question of, well, is Friedrich Merz tough enough? And we've talked about how we think that strong man will be Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg. I don't think Friedrich Merz is that strong man. I do think he's stronger than Olaf Scholz. And I think we could see him take some important steps towards that strong man. And maybe he will even play a very important role under that strong man. But to get to this point, to get this coalition done quickly, he has made some very significant concessions to the left. And you've got this situation in Germany where the left wing, the Social Democrats, had their worst election result basically in their history ever. Catastrophic for them. And yet they end up calling most of the shots, and the government program reflects their wishes largely. So he got his way on defense, but he compromised on a whole lot of spending. There are tougher migration issues. There's lots of debates about, well, are these tough enough? Is it going to change things? I think no matter what he does, the mainstream in German politics has been, from the left and right, has been so bad on migration for so many years. Nobody is going to just trust him out of the gate. They're going to have to wait and see on the migration issue. But he promised that he's not going to reform Germany's debt brake and have Germany borrow a ton more money. Only to immediately renege on that, reform Germany's debt brake, borrow a ton more money, not just for military, but for infrastructure spending, environmental spending. I think people might cut him some slack if it was just for the military. But to get the military through, he had to make these other compromises, and he's basically completely gone back on one of his key election pledges. And so the other massive result this week, and I think massive headline this week, is the Alternative for Deutschland is now Germany's most popular party. And again, this is kind of the same point where Germans are looking and saying, okay, yeah, we want a strong man. We want a strong German military. Is Friedrich Merz strong enough? Actually, we need to go for this Alternative for Deutschland party that is basically a neo-Nazi party. And a lot of people are voting for them. Again, frustration with, people are voting for them for understandable frustrations. Frustration with migration. They don't want massive debt. But this is the rise of a neo-Nazi party in Germany. So a poll this week put them on 25% of public support compared to the Christian Democratic Union's 24%. So they came in second in the last election. But since then, Christian Democratic Union's popularity has plummeted as they've made all these compromises. The AfD support has risen. This is what Mr. Flurry said in a Key of David last year about the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland.
Think about this. When the really big problem, all the parties in Germany will tell you that they don't have leadership, strong leadership. There's weak leadership. And they want to rule not only Germany, but 10 kings in Europe that we've talked about for over 75 years. They are coming, those 10 kings, and they could come and probably will come in 1 or 2 or 3 years. That's how soon it's going to be. Or certainly that's the way it appears right now. They have a new party in Germany called the Alternative for Deutschland. They take second place in national polls. Second place in Germany. And it's really a Nazi party. That's something to think about. Something we all ought to be concerned about. Just think about this. There is a danger in every fifth German voting for the far right. Every fifth German is voting for the far right, talking about Nazism. This is the fastest growing party in Germany. What do you think is happening there? Something that we've been prophesying for over 75 years.
So there's a danger in this Alternative for Deutschland party rising in Germany. And you can definitely see people asking okay, well, how much is democracy worth if a party has their worst ever result and then ends up setting the program for the nation? Do we even have democracy right now? And you have the threat of the rise of things like the Alternative for Deutschland, and that's a dangerous symptom of the rising of this Nazi spirit. Some of the other things in this German coalition agreement are pretty dangerous. They want to make lies illegal, which, I'm not in favor of lying. But we have seen governments after government classify things as untrue and prosecute people for saying them when those things are actually true. We're seeing Germany move in that direction. They're making it easier to ban people from politics because of what they've said. Right now in Germany, there is a journalist that has received a custodial sentence. I think it's like a non-jail sentence, but they've been convicted for making fun of a politician. They posted an obviously fake picture with a politician holding up a sign saying, "I hate free speech." And the journalist that posted that has been convicted. And this incoming coalition government is saying, we want more of that. It's completely delegitimizing Germany's current democratic system. And you can absolutely see that leading to the rise of this strongman. So the Nazi spirit is rising in Germany. The government itself is abandoning core principles of democracy and free speech. And J.D. Vance, of course, has talked about that. And this rise of a strong German leader is a vital, pivotal prophecy to watch. And I would really encourage you to watch the latest Key of David program. And the Key of David program goes out every week. It's about 20, 25 minutes. It's shorter than this show. It comes straight from Trumpet Editor-in-Chief Gerald Flurry. If you're not watching that, I'd really encourage you to go find that on YouTube on the Key of David channel or on Rumble. It's on there as well. Subscribe. And this week's Key of David is a great way to get updated on this story. It's called The Crown Jewels of Charlemagne, and it focuses on this strong leader that we're expecting in Germany and what he's going to be like. Here's a short clip from that.
Germany is arming themselves like never before, and they're going to have nuclear bombs, and it's going to become a strong leadership by a modern Charlemagne, by a modern leader like that, and his greatest power will be deceit, how he can deceive people and then well, talk very nice to them, but then conquer them when they think they have peace with him. Well, this is coming very, very soon, and we have to know that if we're going to be prepared for it, because it's coming whether we know it or not. It certainly is coming.
So that was this weekend's Key of David program. You can also look at our latest Trumpet print edition, where Mr. Flurry has an article, Germany is looking for a new Charlemagne. And again, that shows how Germany and all of Europe, they're hungering for a leader. And they'll even talk about, well, we want a leader like Charlemagne, this medieval king that can unite us and make us powerful. And they don't talk about the rivers of blood this European king waded through. And there's a powerful warning just even from that history. And as both that article and that Key of David will take you through, there are key Bible prophecies that tell us we're expecting a strong leader to rise in Europe. And he'll look like a peacemaker. And again, not knowing the way of peace, well, he'll use peace against us as a weapon. And all of Europe will cheer his rising. Probably America and Britain will be all like, yeah, he's a great guy. He's going to lead to peace. And that is not the case at all. So there's a critical Bible warning that you need to understand to see what's on the news today. And he too, just like the rise of Iran, he's going to play a major role step by step on the return of Jesus Christ. So a critical prophecy to understand, and you can get that in our Trumpet print article. You can get that in our Key of David show. Well, I just wanted to mention one more news item from Europe quickly. And that is that France has said they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Emmanuel Macron visited Egypt for a couple of days, and he said, well, that there's an international conference that France is jointly organizing with Saudi Arabia in New York. And he said, well, France, we're going to recognize that Palestine is an independent state at that meeting. And they want to get as many countries as possible to recognize a Palestinian state. And France is going to try and bring European leaders on board. Now, it doesn't look like necessarily Friedrich Merz and Germany is on board with this. And really, they're the movers and shakers and leaders in Europe. So France may well not be able to get their way on this. But keep watching Europe becoming more involved in the so-called peace process. I mean, really, it's a process that's not really brought much peace in Israel. And again, just like Britain and America will look to Europe for peace, Israel will look to Europe as a peacemaker. And they're going to be horribly, horribly deceived. Well, that is about all that we've got time for. You can get to all the material that we've talked about on our website, thetrumpet.com. The Key of David's there. Our latest Trumpet print magazine is there. All of these things, we've just covered these things pretty briefly in a rundown of the top news of the week. That will allow you to dig in more depth. Thank you very much to our producer, George Haddad, and to Victor Granados, Isaac Lorenz, that help with engineering and production as well in the United States. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at trumpetworld@thetrumpet.com. We'd be very happy to hear from you. If everything goes as planned, we'll be giving you our rundown of the latest Trumpet print magazine on Wednesday's show with Trumpet Assistant Managing Editor Philip Nice. So we'll be talking about all of those articles that we've been alluding to, give you a brief overview of the Trumpet print magazine, a little insight into behind the scenes of making that as well. So that will go out on Wednesday. Until then, keep watching your world.